Crime is never the answer. If you have a mild inconvenience in your life, the best solution is to not ruin the rest of it, but who am I to tell you what to do? Nowadays, if you were to commit any criminal act, you're more than likely to be put inside a police vehicle and taken into court, then most likely jail for however long depending on your crime. It's a good thing that we weren't born during the ages where various forms of torture was used as a way of punishment, gaining answers, or even just for the hell of it, some of which may still be in use to this day. With that in mind, here are 12 of the most violent, disturbing, and pure disgusting torture methods throughout the ages. The medieval times in Europe were not kind to human civilization. Disasters of war, pestilence, and famine dating as far back as the 14th century, with various tools of torture being invented for numerous purposes, especially during the full force of the institution of Inquisition. Some of these methods included the brazen ball, the rack, the pair of anguish, among many others. One of the most commonly used, though, was that of the Judas CRADLE, used during the 16th century of the Spanish Inquisition. The method consisted of the victim being placed on top of a wooden pyramid-shaped device with his or her hands and legs tied so that their weight could not be shifted. Their feet were also tied to increase pain whenever the feet was able to move. The victim would slowly be descended on the pointed edge of the pyramid, slowly inserting into the anus or vagina of the victim. The form of torture would last from as little as a few hours to almost entire days on end. How long victims were placed on the pyramid was based on their ability to withstand the pain. With this in mind, even weights were added onto the victim's legs, increasing the pain tenfold and resulted in a quick death. Oil was sometimes also put onto the device, making it more so impossible to escape, with the victims constantly slipping down, allowing the device to dig in deeper and deeper. Even if the victims would survive such a grueling torture method, they were at high risk of severe infections, as the Judas CRADLE was never washed after being used. Sometimes they were even raised up by the ropes, not out of mercy, but only prolonging the pain and misery of the victim. The fact that victims would be put through this for days on end, and the thought of waking up to only do it again for longer, sends a chill down the spine of even the strongest of minds. Most of the Earth's population loves a drink or two. Beers, ciders, vodkas, whiskies, even cocktails could be bought to quench the thirst of any man or woman. But during the 30-Year War, a conflict primarily fought in Central Europe from 1618 to 1648 that estimates a total of close to 8 million deaths, a method of torture known as Sweden trunk was steadfast. The name was invented by Germans who fell victim to Swedish troops during the 30-Year War. It was even administered by other international troops. Even civilians that followed the Swedish baggage train who received no pay would use this method. The victim, mostly peasants and other town citizens, would be tied to a board and gagged and forced to hand over hidden money, food, animals, or even to force intercourse with female victims. Most of the tortured was forced to swallow copious amounts of liquids by way of a funnel. It sounds a bit like the modern waterboarding technique. However, instead of just water, the victims would swallow unappetizing, sometimes boiling liquids. These included urine, excrement, liquid manure, grey water which has been contaminated by fecal matter, and even sewage was used. If the illness and possibility of bacterial infection wasn't bad enough, the victim would experience extreme gastric pain, a nightmare for those with IBS. Because liquids are incompressible, the bowels must expand to agonizing proportions to accommodate the large amount of fluids. But it doesn't stop there. The torturers would then squeeze the stomach with wooden boards and beat the boards by stamping on them or hitting them with sticks. In some instances, they would not use the boards, and instead stab the victim's stomach with spears, even using horses to trample on them. I think I speak for all of us when I say, the 30-Year War truly was a terrifying moment in history. Most types of torture include physical manipulation, mutilating a victim's body beyond comprehension. But not all methods can be done by physicalities. Instead, using methods that psychologically crush the victim. Such is the case for the method known as white room torture. The method is particularly used in Iran, however there has been evidence of use in the United States, Venezuela, Ireland, and other parts of Europe. The victim would be placed inside just a plain white cell that is used to deprive the prisoner of all their senses and identity. The walls, floor, ceiling, and even their clothes would be white, with neon tubes positioned above the occupant in such a way that no shadows can be seen. The same lights being used to brighten up the cell, so the occupant loses hours of sleep. The cell is also soundproof. Any voices and social interaction is void. The prisoners can hear nothing else but themselves. The victim is also fed white food, most notably unseasoned rice, depriving the prisoner of all their senses. The surface of the cell are all smooth, robbing the victim of tact. Prisoners can be held in these sensory depriving rooms for as little as a few months to even years at a time, with the effects being well documented. Prisoners become depersonalized, losing their personal identity for extended episodes of isolation, as a result, causing hallucinations or even psychotic breakdowns. Iranian journalist Ibrahim Nabavi made claims of not being able to sleep without pills, that the loneliness never truly leaves even after you are freed. They get what they want out of you without any physical altercation, make you believe anything that they say, from a president's resignation to as major as someone whom you trust telling lies about you to the guards. You begin to break and then begin to confess. It just goes to show that extreme boredom and loss of senses can take any man or woman to insanity.
You can't beat a classic, and this form of torture and execution is no laughing matter, unless if you're a sadist. Made famous by Vlad III, the Prince of Wallachia during the 15th century, was known for this technique at the time. He was given the name Vlad the Impaler, but most of us today know that there is another nickname for Vlad, one that almost everyone recognizes: Dracula. But Vlad wasn't the only one to do this, nor was he the first. The earliest known use of impalement occurring in the ancient Near East, the Code of Hammurabi promulgated in 1772 BC for a woman who killed her husband for another man's sake. The basic premise is simple. A human being would be sent to be tortured or executed by a way of a stake, pole, spear, or even hooks that penetrate either partially or completely through the torso, particularly used for crimes against the state. There are numerous of impalement variants. Some victims would survive for as little as a few seconds to as much as 8 days or more, according to local surgeons of the time. Victims could be penetrated from all angles, through the chest and out through the back, directly through the heart, and vice versa. The possible worst variant being impaled through the entire body, from the rear end all the way through the mouth of the victim. Some instances, victims would be hung by iron meat hooks digging through the ribs, leaving them to die a slow and painful death. The fact that there are possible hundreds of ways to impale a person with anything that's sharp is honestly terrifying to think about. It might be best to keep out of your kitchen cupboards. Sometimes you gotta crack a few eggs to make an omelette, or in this case, crack a few fingers and ligaments to make someone give you answers. This is the case for an instrument of torture known as the thumbscrew, first used in early modern Europe. The instrument is essentially a vice, sometimes seen with protruding studs on the interior surfaces, and comes in different variations. It can also be referred to as a thumbkin, a term used during the 1675 to 1685. The victim's ligaments would be placed in the vice and be slowly crushed, ranging from thumbs, fingers, and also the big toes of prisoners. They were also sometimes lined with sharp metal points to puncture through skin, inflicting more pain in the nail beds. There were even larger vices applied to the victim's feet, elbows, arms, knees, and even the full head. Most historians believe that the thumbscrew came from the Russian army, where officers would use the device to punish soldiers who misbehaved. Those who were sent for interrogation with assistance from the thumbscrew were said to have been in these vices for many days at a time. Sometimes even the threat of torture by one of these devices was enough to make someone confess. They could be used in the wilderness, in a house, or even on a ship. Slave masters of the Atlantic slave trade used thumbscrews to subdue leaders of revolts, who previously tried to take over ships crossing from Africa to America, leading all the way up until the 19th century. Forget about arthritis. The thumbscrew is what we all should be worried about, especially if you want to keep your fingers intact. The ancient Greeks were surely ahead of their time, introducing various of archetypes ranging from philosophy, politics, science, astrology, and the earliest democracies, and maybe also a few inhuman torture devices. The brazen ball, also known as the bronze ball, was a torture device designed in ancient Greece by Perillus of Athens, a gift to the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas as a new means of executing criminals. The structure of the ball was said to be life-sized, made entirely out of bronze with a singular door on one side. Its head was designed with a tube system that stops, making the prisoner's screams sound like the bellowing of an infuriated bull. Quite intuitive for its time. Those who were condemned to torture by way of the ball were locked inside the device, with a fire being set underneath it. The metal would then heat up the stomach of the bowl, scorching the prisoner inside, cooking and roasting him or her alive. Phalaris had commanded that the bowl be designed in such a manner that smoke would rise in spicy clouds of incense. Once the bowl was reopened, showing the charred remains of the body, the victim's scorched bones were said to then shine like jewels and were made into bracelets. The story goes to say that Perillus believed to receive a reward for such an invention. However, Phalaris, who was disgusted by Perillus' reward beliefs, tricked him into testing the bowl's mechanics, where Perillus was locked in, set ablaze, and burned alive. Saint Eunice, a Christian, was also sent to this execution, where he was roasted in the bowl with his wife and children, courtesy of Emperor Hadrian. Just another reason to stay out of those cow fields.
Ever wondered what a claustrophobia nightmare looks like? Enclosed spaces with nowhere and no way to move? Yeah, the Middle Ages must have thought, let's add some spikes to the equation and voila, you have the Iron Maiden device. The Iron Maiden is of an average human height, at least tall enough to fit in one, small enough for the tortured to feel encapsulated. There was actually no evidence of the device's existence, at least not before the 19th century. However, there are ancient reports of a similar device being used around 200 BC by Nabis, the Spartan tyrant. The victim would be placed inside of the sharp structure and the doors being forced shut, the spikes on the inside of the door impaling all over the victim's body. There was a belief during the Middle Ages that the Iron Maidens would close by themselves, killing anyone that stands in its path. People back then were truly suspicious of anything that they had no idea of or how to at least combat it. This belief is considered to be a myth. Some say that the Iron Maiden spikes were not necessarily long and would only puncture the victim if they moved by a little. It's one thing to having to worry about impalement from a spike or even being trapped inside of a metallic structure, but to have both at the same time? I think I'll pass. My advice, make the band's name and run to the hills. The Middle Ages were truly filled with an unlimited supply of torture methods that any psychopath would use to his or her heart's content, and this circular device of agony is no stranger to gruesome ends to many lives. The breaking wheel, or just simply the wheel, was a method used as a public execution technique primarily in Europe during the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. The technique involved the breaking of bones of a criminal and or bludgeoning him or her to death. Convicted murderers and robbers were taken to a public scaffold site and tied to the floor. The wheel was typically created out of wood, the same types of wheels used on wooden transport carts and carriages. The first act of the method was to mutilate the victim's body by bludgeoning them, however, not straight away to death. It would start with the wheel being dropped onto the victim's shin bones and leg bones, breaking them in multiple places. The wheel would then be dropped higher on the body, slowly working its way up to the stomach, the hands, and the arms until the eventual end would come by the wheel being dropped on the victim's neck or heart in a coup de grace. The second act involved the body being paraded onto another wheel, this time spiked and placed on top of a pole, where the victim would either be decapitated or left to die if he or she survived the first act. The body would be left on the wheel for the rodents and scavenger birds to feast on the dead flesh. The earliest possible origins of the wheel technique is referred back to the 6th century. During this time, the victim would be placed in a deep track and then essentially ran over by a heavy wagon. The latest was as early as the 19th century. The last known execution from capital punishment was on the 13th of August 1841 in Prussia, where the head was decapitated, the body was burned, and then broken on the wheel, just to make sure that the man is definitely dead. I've never been on a boat before, at least not properly, but I can safely say that I want no part of them if this is what was being done to people back in the day. Scaphism, also known simply as the boats, is an alleged ancient Persian method of execution. The word comes from the Greek meaning of hollowed out. It is considered, however, to be a pure literary invention of the ancient Greek literature, as it was never attested in ancient Persia. Historically, the first known mention of Scaphism was seen in Plutarch's description of Mithridates' execution, a young Persian soldier who accidentally killed the rebel claimant to the throne, Cyrus the Younger, during the Battle of Kanuksha. The soldier was shot in between two boats, however his hands, feet and head were left outside with no way to move. He was forced to eat honey and milk, and his face was even covered entirely in honey. Over time, his body would be completely exposed to the sun, allowing many forms of insects to be attracted to the honey. The insects would then begin to feed on the honey and the face of Mithridates. Whilst being eaten alive by insects, his excrement would attract various vermin and other insects to feast on the rest of his body. At the exposed sun generating heat in the boats, the animals would force their way through the bowels of the soldier. After being in the boats, suffering for 17 whole days, the soldier eventually passed. He was found with his flesh devoured and hundreds of species of insects and vermin still feeding on the remains. It just goes to show the circle of life will always catch up with you, that we as humans will never be on top of the food chain, if given the wrong circumstances. Oh, the 14th century. Truly a time to be alive. Well, not necessarily if you were silly enough to commit high treason. A statutory penalty from 1352, commissioned after the Treason Act of the year before, being hung, drawn and quartered was a ritual for men convicted of high treason in England. The first known recording of the execution method was during the reign of King Henry III from 1216 to 1272. The convicted traitor of the king was tied to a wooden panel of sorts and drawn by a horse to the place of execution, where he was then hanged to near death, then emasculated, which is the removal of the male genitalia. Then he was disemboweled, beheaded, and finally quartered, either with blades or even using horses to pull the arms and legs apart from the victim. Many different people were sent to this form of punishment, including English Catholic priests during the Elizabethan era. The remains of those who were killed were usually displayed across the entire country as a warning to other potential traitors in the future. This form of torture was legal across many countries for centuries, hanging people who they feel disrespected the ruling of their respective leaders. This process of public execution in public, however, was ended in 1868 by the Capital Punishment Amendment Act, and then was abolished further in England by the Forfeiture Act of 1870. However, the death sentence for treason was still in effect, not until it was abolished as recently as 23 years ago, thanks to the Crime and Disorder Act of 1998. Being dismembered is never a comforting thought, let alone hanging by the neck, having your genitals cut off and being gutted, and having all that thrown in the fire as you watch in horror, only to have your head chopped off and then your body pulled apart, literally limb by limb. How lovely. Exactly what it says on the tin, rat torture can be considered as one of the more simple yet gruesome ways to die. The history of the torture method dates all the way back to the Elizabethan era, where Roman Catholic writers alleged that in the Tower of London was a dungeon of rats, where the River Thames would draw in rats as the tide flowed in. Prisoners would be sent into the dungeons where they would be tied or chained with no way to move on a bench or table. The torturers would then place upon the victim a bowl or bucket filled entirely with a family of rats. The victim, of course, was naked. The method then involved hot pieces of charcoal being placed on top of the bucket, creating an immeasurable amount of heat. Rats absolutely despise hot locations. Once the charcoal was placed on top, their only way out is down, through the victim's body. The rats would gnaw into the very bowels of the victim, digging through the chest, the stomach, and the intestines in order to escape the heat. The method wasn't just used in Europe, it was also a steadfast method in South America during the later half of as recent as the 20th century. Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, and even Argentina enforced such a hideous torture method, the last one using the method of a rectoscope, which was used primarily for Jewish prisoners. It consisted of inserting living rats into the victim's rectum or vagina through a tube. Rat torture is heavily featured in fictional novels, examples including Pit and the Pendulum written by Edgar Allan Poe, The Torture Garden by Octave Mirabou, and even American Psycho written by Bret Easton Ellis. And for its reputation, one would hope that this method will never see the light of day again. Why not? One more from medieval times. Europe truly was not a desirable place to take residence if it was doing all of these hellish methods, and soul torture is definitely no exception. There are various ways that this method was carried out, each method uniquely different. During the reign of the Roman Emperor Caligula, the victim would be sentenced to be sawed in half transversely, meaning through the front side of the body and out through the back. Other methods, including the cases of Morocco, it is stated that the method was performed lengthwise, either from the groin upwards and from the skull downwards. The story about Simon the Zealot, an obscure saint among the apostles of Jesus, the person was described to be hung upside down with no fastenings or support boards and was sawn apart vertically through the middle, starting at the groin. Essentially, you're being cut in half by a more than likely blunt saw blade, blood gushing all over the place, and apparently this would have been seen as a normal way to torture someone. If that doesn't send chills down your spine, then I'm not certain what would, and you'd be a braver person than I am for sure.